We just want to let the group know, all the attendees know that we will be recording this session. If you're not comfortable with being seen on camera, do feel free to keep your camera off. But we just wanted to give you a heads up because we had a couple of requests for this to be on YouTube. So hopefully this will live on after today's session, and we hope you're okay with that. Thank you. Sorry, Rajni, please.
Right. I mean, very briefly, to get started, I mean, we are very excited to do this with SPICE. I've been hearing about SPICE from Malika, and it sounds like such a wonderful initiative, a really needed initiative to talk about less than mainstream issues that is happening within South Asia, and especially to see a young group of thinkers based in Singapore kind of doing this. It has been really incredible. So Muragala is really grateful for that. Just to introduce myself, along with a few others, including Harindra, who is on this call, we co-founded this space called Muragala in Colombo a couple of years ago. And our main goal was to just have this collective space for academic chats, policy chats, and informal discussions, and to do kind of research that we really want to do rather than research that is necessarily mandated by an external organization. And that I think kind of neatly ties in with the topic of today's discussion as well. So I'll let maybe Harindra introduce himself next. You're muted, Harindra.
So it goes. Yeah, wonderful to be here. And if you can hear me in the first place. And I'm Harindra and based in Colombo, more or less. And this space, we started Muragala in 2022. Actually 2021, when we understood quite in context that Sri Lanka was coming to a very tense point with regard to youth unrest. That was in early 2022, like late 2021 and 2022. But much of the work started later. And then we had this Aragalaya youth uprising and coming all that. So it's very good to see, I mean, young people across Asia and across the world doing so many things, especially at a time when, like statistically and structurally, young people's space is shrinking in comparison to what the previous generations have been having. So in a space like this, feeling the crunch, feeling hopeful is so important, and I'm looking forward to this discussion in this broader context. Sanduleka, if you can go in.
Yeah. So hi, I'm Sanduleka Kanaga. Speaking of the youth unrest, I think I directly connect to that, so I'll take it on from there. I joined because of the youth unrest. I wanted a platform where I could speak of things and talk about political discourse mainly. So I came on board with Muragala pretty recently. So I'm a very new research analyst, and thank you for having me here. Even though this sphere of political discourse, I'm not going to say it's very new, but actually taking it apart analytically is new to me. I think these kind of topics we've all encountered. So it's nice to be able to talk about it on an official platform like this.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. I'm also going to ask the SPICE team to introduce ourselves. Maybe I'll start. I'm Shania. I'm, I guess, a newer member of SPICE as well. Malika and Michelle, who are both on this call, originally kickstarted this as a project in our university. But I think I'll let them introduce the thinking behind it more. But overall, I'm here because as a young person, I feel like it's important for us to remain politically connected. But as a young person who now studied and works abroad, I do find it hard to remain connected to the politics happening back home. But I think it's of increasing importance that we remain connected and we remain open to hearing views and voices that aren't being represented in mainstream media, and perhaps even in mainstream research. And I think these spaces are how we create those conversations. Yeah, maybe Michelle?
Hi, yes, I'm Michelle. I'm from Pakistan, and I think along with everything that Shania mentioned, I'm also, I think, invested in having spaces to learn about and connect across all of South Asia in terms of our struggles, our issues, etc. And I think it's very important that we know what's happening beyond our borders as well. And yeah, I'm based in Singapore right now, and working in the research space. Yeah, Malika, go ahead.
Thanks, team. I won't take too long to introduce myself, but I will explain a little bit of the thinking behind SPICE and why Michelle and I started SPICE, beyond all the talk about why it is important to be politically active and connected. But really quickly, my name is Malika, she, her pronouns. I am currently in Sri Lanka. I am Sri Lankan, but I'm typically based in Singapore. The thinking behind SPICE was Michelle and I like to think that we're politically engaged, curious, interested. But when she and I were one day talking, and she was talking about the disappearances of Baloch people in Pakistan, and I was very surprised that I really had not heard much about it prior to it. And I was surprised because I like to think that I'm in touch with news that's outside of Sri Lanka as well. But I'm realizing increasingly that that news is often about the West. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to care about politics outside of South Asia, but it was concerning to me that I didn't know a lot about what was happening in South Asia, considering that these were our neighbors. And I think sometimes there's some attitudes. I think a lot of South Asians are typically, well, at least I've had the privilege of knowing a lot of South Asians who are politically engaged and concerned. But I do think that it's sometimes difficult to understand what's happening beyond our borders, maybe because of language barriers, maybe because the history is so complicated and it's really hard to kind of know where to start. And that's really the intention behind SPICE. I think our belief is you're not just a Sri Lankan or a Pakistani or an Indian, but really our identities extend beyond that. And there's a duty to be concerned about what's happening in other people's countries, especially our neighbors. And I think, not to go too far into this, I would love to do another event on this, but if we're thinking about Nepal, I think there's a lot of connections and discussion connecting Nepal to Muragala in Sri Lanka. And I think that is indicative of how history repeats itself, and also actions and reactions tend to extend beyond a time and place in history. So it's important to see these connections. So that is the motivation behind SPICE, but I think we've taken a bit of time. I'm happy to continue and pass the baton again to you, Shania.
Okay. Before we get started with the discussion, we've dropped some ideas of what the discussion is about in the title, but I would promise you have no idea what is coming in this discussion. There are many topics we're going to cover. I'd like to invite everyone who is actually on the call to just drop a little message in the chat and tell us where you're from, introduce your pronouns, and just, yeah, say hi.
How
I
about,
can't see the Zoom chat.
how about while we're waiting for people to post the messages, maybe we can actually get started with some of the house rules, Shania, and then we can continue with the discussion.
Okay, sounds good. So overall, we want this to be a comfortable, warm, welcoming space where no question is too stupid. We want this to be this way so that even for people who aren't familiar with the topics that we're talking about, you feel warm and welcomed in this space. So on that note, we will be following Chatham House rules. What that means is that you can talk about the topics or the ideas, comments that people have made outside of this discussion, but we would ask that you don't name the person who is asking the question or name the person who has made the comment, just so that this is an environment where everyone can share their thoughts and share their ideas freely. That being said, we also do want to create a space where people with lived experiences can share their experiences freely and foremost. And we do want to say that if you have experiences that are relevant to the topics that we're discussing, please do raise your hand. Please say that you have something to add, and we would love to give you that platform to share, because we think that often spaces like these don't give enough space to people with lived experience. Yeah. Anything else to add, team? No.
Just be curious, I guess, and I think we can go ahead with the discussion.
Yeah, cool. So as you can tell, this discussion is about USAID and the cuts and the reverberations that we're seeing around in Sri Lanka specifically, but also we'd like to explore how these reverberations might be indicative of changes in the broader global order. For some context, oops, should have been showing this earlier. But yeah, here's some background on the USAID cuts for anyone who perhaps isn't totally aware yet. The US, through the State Department and through USAID, has been a major player in foreign diplomacy, has been a major player in development aid for many decades. And it has come to the point where globally, a lot of civil society movements, not just in Sri Lanka, have been quite dependent on USAID. For example, Sri Lanka received 53 million USD from USAID in 2023 and 2024 alone. Which is why earlier this year, on January 20th, 2025, when the Trump administration announced there would be a cut of almost all USAID funding, and a review of all USAID funding, including funding coming from the State Department. This caused massive reverberations in the development sector globally and worldwide. And I think this kind of sets the stage for the scale and severity of the consequences in the civil sectors worldwide and in Sri Lanka that we're talking about. Yeah, Malika?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great introduction. And I think, thank you, Shania, for giving that. Just to kick us off in terms of the discussion, to the Muragala team, given that this conversation has been about development aid and human rights, I think when we talk about it and we talk about USAID cuts, we look at Trump's election as the beginning of the end. But I think the Muragala team has a different position on this, and you argue that the shifts in global power relations have occurred prior to this, and that has had significant consequences on democracy, human rights, etc. Could you maybe expound on this context that we're setting for this discussion?
Yeah. So thanks for setting the context for this and giving us an idea of the kind of damage that's done. So just to reiterate, that's nearly like 90% of the USAID, the projects that have been funded by USAID, and most of them were in the humanitarian section or the development section, which is what USAID was popular for. And to say that this started with Trump would be saying this hasn't been happening for a while, but I believe he's the one who drove the final nail on the coffin. Because foreign aid has, the reason that it matters to understand about this shift is that foreign aid has always been controversial, and this is something we know. And some people from some schools of thought think that aid creates this dependency and undermines free markets, whereas some people think that it reproduces neocolonial control and serves the interest of former colonial powers, which I believe is true onto its own. What has changed now is that US no longer frames aid as a moral responsibility or like a shared duty to reduce global inequality. And now it's treated more like a business deal, where if there's no enough return on investment, and if there's no transactional value to it, where US doesn't benefit from it as much as they want to, they're not going to do it anymore. So for me, at least for us actually, it's more of a narrative shift. Because it's not like they haven't benefited off of USAID or foreign aids at all. They've always been benefiting because obviously the donor-recipient power dynamic is always there. But it's just that it's out in the open now, and Trump has been charging at it like a bull in the China shop. And the shift is rooted in Trump's America First populism and a really aggressive economic nativism, where even during the 2024 campaign, he consistently described aid as wasteful, crazy waste of taxpayers' money, and that nobody in America benefited off of that. And his policies are organized mainly around themes of make America safe again, affordable and energy dominant, drain the swamp, bring back American values. And all of these kind of boil down to the fact that aid will only be funded in the future if they align with two criteria. That is, if it's really efficient, according to the checklist that Trump has given, and if it aligns with US foreign policy interests. Because of this reason, the sectors that are hit the hardest are humanitarian assistance, health, and education. Because according to the way that they're framing this narrative, these sectors do not align with the Make America Great Again rhetoric that Trump is driving so hard. Because, for example, in between 2011 to 2015, USAID supported more than 50 million children in around 45 countries through different programs. And that itself speaks to the scale of the kind of work that USAID has been doing. And moving on to how aid is used as a foreign policy weapon, which I think is what's been really highlighted at this moment, is it has never really been neutral, like I mentioned before, because it has always served US interests in some way. Because under Trump and Biden both, aid had become increasingly tied to countering either China's influence in Africa, Eurasia, and Latin America. And even during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw the vaccine diplomacy, we saw how aid was redirected towards countries with higher democratic rankings. So the reason why we say that this has been a long time coming is that it has been subtle and it has been existing, and we've got this looming sense of its presence. But I feel like now it's almost like they've completely unraveled the system that upkept their values and fundamentals. So now we're seeing it in a light that they actually was even before. For at least, I think that this is not just about Trump, it's bigger than Trump, and it reflects a longer crisis of multilateralism, because the narrative has shifted from wealthier nations having a duty to where it's a strict cost-benefit logic, where aid is justified only if it advances the power of the country that's giving out the money. Which is why we are seeing ripple effects with other donors like the UK, Germany, France, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's the stance that I take, because out of all the reading and research that has gone in, and I think it has been a long time coming, it's just that we're seeing it really clearly right now.
And Sandaleka, if I could ask you a follow-up question, right? You mentioned that now aid is being directed only into those sectors that are strategic to the Trump administration. What sectors are those? Because I think we think a lot about what has been lost, but what remains?
I think so. His policies would mostly be defense, strategizing, and those are the two that's on the top, actually, because he's also the leftover of USA, if there's any, has been taken under the US State Department. So it's mostly the defense sector and strategic alliances. Those are the ones he's, I think, actively driving for.
Yeah.
I think just to add to that, because we don't want this discussion to be very regimental, Shania and I both work in the impact space in Singapore, and I have the benefit of working very closely with foreign and regional philanthropists. And I think something interesting that was told to me very recently is that ODA is being slashed by, that's overseas development aid, is being slashed by, they're looking at 8 to 15% being slashed. And when they're looking at countries who are not slashing it, they're indicating that defense spending is starting to be like, the descriptions are changing. And so they're putting defense aids and budgets on defense under ODA, which is a development. And I think to Sadhuleka's point about where the money is going, this is an interesting and worrying development. But yeah, Sadhuleka, I think you said something very interesting earlier on about this kind of competition between US and other major players, with new players like China or even the EU Global Gateway stepping into the aid space. What are the risks and opportunities here for grassroots and human rights movements in countries like Sri Lanka? And what do they pose for feminist and queer activism? Big question.
Yeah, I think Harindra, we had kind of divided a bit of the points. If Harindra could come in at this point.
Yeah, no, actually you asked about what the micro impact of these cuts have been. So one thing is that we've been working with some like researching about what is going on, and also seeing the impact on the micro at the micro level on some institutions. When the funding cuts came, I mean, I can give you one concrete example, like one organization that was working with the LGBT community in a regional setting. They have not met their host community, as in the about 35 LGBTQ persons. I mean, they used to have monthly meetings, but they have not been able to hold at least one until like for the first 10 months of the year. So that's kind of that. And then, I mean, just to see the impact of it. And then, yeah. Then I'll think of it. So this is the small, like how it impacts at the small level. But to take a cue from what Sanduleka said and what Malika said, I think like we need to frame the question, like ask the question what it means of the paradigm shift that's taking place in the funding space. Sorry, I had shut my camera off. Sorry. Right. So that means, I mean, we were in a paradigm. The USAID and the aid paradigm, ODA paradigm, was the last 30 years has been in a framework of good governance. That means it meant global North expected the global South to transform their governance into fighting, like increasing human rights and then broadening human rights base, and also fighting corruption, anti-corruption. So these were the two main legs on which the development paradigm walked. And now and WTO, World Trade Organization for that matter, and UNHRC, for example, were the two watchdogs of this paradigm. And now increasingly, these countries do not see the importance of these these institutions, because the terms of trade have changed. Now, when the terms of trade change, the institutions are being undermined. We see how US has been pulling out of these organizations. And it's also on the other, like in the on parallel track, how Sri Lanka is also finding its way easy in UN human rights these commitments, for example, also shows how the whole paradigm is now shifting. So it comes in this context. So now, when we say the funding cuts it comes in a certain context of what the global North and the superpowers need. I'll stop there, and yeah.
Yes.
Probably, yeah.
Maybe if I can just step in terms of contextualizing this structurally. I mean, something that's always at the back of our minds. I think Saduleka and Harindra have been doing that. I just wanted to add a point on how, with what is happening with the US aid cuts, it's happening very much on the backdrop of what Saduleka mentioned, populism. So the rise of right-wing populism that we're seeing not only in the US, not only in Europe, but also in places within Asia, such as from India to Turkey, for example. And I think this is really important because, again, as what Saduleka mentioned, what we're having here is really a competition, or really a narrative, a framing of the narrative and a shift in the narrative. And in terms of aid shifting from being seen as something that has been a historical responsibility of the more developed countries because of the colonial histories that we have had, to now speaking of this very business-like logic of how much of return of investment there is on aid. And this is, again, something that we are not seeing only with development partners like the US, with initiatives such as Global Gateway that is coming up, that the EU is proposing. We are seeing this very much as a response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And we are seeing a decline in commitment, even of countries such as the EU, which have traditionally their development aid has traditionally been very important for countries in the global south, such as Sri Lanka. But we're seeing a decreasing commitment to classical development aid and increasing move towards initiatives such as Global Gateway. I mean, if I think the listeners want to know more about Global Gateway, they can, I think, research it. But basically what it has is an infrastructure-driven focus. And they're kind of trying to match the infrastructure-heavy focus within the BRI as well. They link it to something like climate change, green climate, and things like that. But at a sense, it is the business logic that dominates here rather than a more, how to say, a more humanist logic that underpinned aid or development aid originally. And this shift is really significant because while on the one hand, business logics or the importance of profit is prioritized over the well-being of communities, alongside that, we have what Malika was talking about, which is this increasing securitization as a priority within countries in the West. And we are very much seeing the effects of that, I think, in Sri Lanka as well. Alongside the dip in development aid in Sri Lanka, we are, at least at the early stages, increasingly more outfits that have a securitization or geopolitical focus on them. And so these are some of the early signs of these shifts that are happening. Probably, yeah, I'll stop speaking too much and yeah, let's have it as a conversation.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate, Rajni, what you just shared, but also Harinder, building off what you said. It's hard not to see the change in the discourse priorities and the movement away from human rights-based discourse, right, as unlinked to the weakening of our multilateral organizations, because multilateral organizations such as, I mean, the UN, WTO, all of these are based on an idea that there are certain rights, certain values and norms that are worth multilateral collaboration across borders. And these are the values that we're talking about, right? Democracy, feminism, LGBTQ rights, for example. And this is the development aid that used to be coming in, that we're now seeing a very sharp and rapid pivot away from, right? At the same time as we're seeing increasing securitization and also increasing prioritization of in domestic interests over global interests. And I think what Sandanika said in the beginning is very true, which is that domestic interests have always been prioritized, but at least there was a facade of a greater good. And now that the facade is stripped away, we're kind of wondering, how does this play out, not just in the US, but within our countries, and how do our governments respond to it? So maybe now is also a good time to bring up what the Sri Lankan government and what Sri Lankan political forces have been mentioning about the aid cuts themselves, because aid is fundamentally a political tool, not just by the givers, but also from the receivers. And so we've collated just a couple of quotes from opposition forces in Sri Lanka. And I think, without getting into them into too much depth, I'm sure we will in the discussion, I think it's quite clear that there is an acknowledgement that the US's foreign aid maybe is used to promote interests that are somehow antithetical to Sri Lanka's own interests or to Sri Lankans' own personal priorities. And this idea that human rights-based aid is somehow detrimental to Sri Lankan culture, to Sri Lankan norms and society. And this is an idea that seems to be very deeply embedded into our political discourse. And for example, right, this idea that US aid provided 8.1 million rupees to suppress the rights of Sinhala Buddhist groups in a country that is Sinhala Buddhist majority. Like, I think these ideas are quite pernicious. And it just goes to show how far aid is, in fact, a politically mobilized tool, not just by the giving countries, right? So I guess one of our next questions is, on the direct governmental level, how might we have expected the NPP government to react to this, and how have they surprised us?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the two parts, what did we expect from the NPP government? I think there's some reckoning moment for the NPP government, because it also is something, compared to previous governments, it has been promising a lot of inclusion. And so, mobilizing quite a pink government, not just because of the quite a pink campaign putting with women at the front. But yeah, like practicalities come home when you come to the government, and compromises are quick. And when the aid cuts came, the government did not say anything in January, didn't say anything at all, and probably said and some of the fleeting comments were that, well, we need to look into alternative means, and it's not a big deal. And later, when the trade tariffs came, the government acknowledged, yes, there is something in it, but we totally are in control of it. And even it was also an election time in Sri Lanka, so the president said, "Oh, we are in a public rally. No, we have dealt with it, and we are going to make a joint statement in 2 weeks." That was in April, and that joint statement never came. As to how any government responds to a situation like this in this part of the world, I think we need to understand it within a certain degree of populism, because no one loses these days. Everyone has a narrative, and narratives. So the good thing about polarization is it's such pernicious, and also it's so polarized that you don't really hear what the other one says. So you are within this narrative. So if you look at how, there's a lot of Pakistani and Indian listeners here, how both countries have a narrative of victory in their relations is such a good example, but for the government, this is at the narrative level. And in terms of actually what the government has been doing, the government has not been topping up where funding have been, or has not been coming in. And my brief interaction with the social services department, which is generally into these matters, has been that they have been completely out from, they have not been coming in to match the differences. And whenever that has been when especially for organizations that had to go through big cuts, has always been compensated by private parties and philanthropy funding. I'm sorry, I don't have anything else to add here.
Yeah. I think probably I might just, what was really interesting is, so as Harindra is explaining the kind of way in which the government responds, I think you highlighted just before in the previous slide how certain opposition politicians and religious leaders responded to the occasion. Saduleka might have a bit more to speak on that, but I just wanted to mention what was not just interesting, but also alarming. And I think, again, Malika mentions this before as well, is that we see that the discourse that happens at the Sri Lankan context very much mirrors the language of, say, Trump or Elon Musk and that particular camp within the US. Because on the one hand, we have within the US this attack on left politics. And in Sri Lanka, it happens to be that a more left-leaning government comes into power. And so when the opposition kind of reacts or tries to manipulate the aid cuts and how it is kind of its impact within Sri Lanka, it is done with less of an eye on how it impacts the marginalized groups, but rather they kind of co-opt the language of right-wing kind of politics within the US, and then they adapt it to the Sri Lankan context. And this is on a number of fronts. On the attack of left politics, because within the US we see this rhetoric of how the economic issues that they have is really the problem of either immigrants or of a particular left politics having captured the state within the US. And that framing, within Sri Lanka, of course, it's different because we don't have necessarily an anti-immigrant rhetoric, but it comes in the form of, say, racism against ethnic minorities or religious minorities, Islamophobia, and so on. So we do see that happening. And I think maybe Saduleka might also have a bit more of how that plays out. Yeah.
Yeah. So as Rajni and Harinta both said, surprisingly, the government has not been very vocal about it, but in the heat of USAID cuts, there were people from the opposition who were extremely vocal about it. And like Rajni said, there has been direct and the interesting part is that some of these figures who are now siding with Trump's and Musk's rhetorics are ones who are not natural sympathizers with the West or the way that they've been thinking thus far. So all of a sudden, this narrative shift has given them an impetus, some kind of fodder to go on with driving their narratives. And like Rajni correctly mentioned, most of the narratives are very similar Buddhist nationalism narratives which keep coming up most of the time. And it was a very conservative take on the issue, claiming that such aid was used to fund the regime destabilization of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, which meant that automatically they delegitimized the Aragalia, which we know because we were part of was something much more than that. And that all of this aid came in to attack the Sinhala Buddhist cultural paradigm, which is where the LGBTQ plus rights come in. And they kept reiterating the fact very strongly that the right-wing attack on DEI and rising transphobia in the US West, and they just aligned it with what's going on here. I mean, I don't want to name drop. You've mentioned names here, but three of the most strong comments came from the three personalities that I mentioned here. And I just want to mention quickly before I take up your time is that Vimal Veeravansha, one of the projects he directly attacked was this project called MEND, which is Media Empowerment for Democratic Sri Lanka, which was implemented by the International Research and Exchange Board with USAID funding, which was basically it was a media exchange program for investigative journalism where they, ran them through different programs and different workshops. However, Veeravansha was quick to hone in on the fact that this workshop was arranged so that Sri Lankan journalists would be taught how to avoid using binary gendered language, even though this was just one component of the program. So this was just cut down. So it's, I feel like this platform has been created for them to come back with this. And it's not just these. There's, I don't know whether you've seen this, but there's this organization called Mauwarunge Theravuna, but they also went on a protest with both saying they agree with Trump's anti-wokeism programs and that this LGBTQ order and this warping of minds of people should be completely removed or obliterated from the narratives that are going on in Sri Lanka. So yeah, there has been a back and forth and bouncing from this end to that. It's almost like an echo chamber, I'm sure, if you place them one against the other. But yeah, it's an interesting turn of events and narratives.
Yeah, I think to that point, what's interesting is that, and this happens in many versions, and I hope that our audience is also kind of understanding this tension that we're trying to play out, right? There's USAID and there's some very, even prior to the funding cuts and how aid is being a little bit more overt in its intentions, there is some understanding about USAID being for soft power, for soft power and the establishment of power in certain regions. And that exists and that is true. Well, it could be true. But there's also this tension then in Sri Lanka, especially with maybe some of the more conservative ideals, where anything that is seen as other is immediately framed as foreign, which is sometimes seen as a bad word in Sri Lanka. And that is supposed to be kind of self-explanatory. But secondly, it's often framed as an attack on culture, and this is often seen as conservative Sinhala Buddhist culture. And this rhetoric is difficult because it's often some of the loudest voices that are painting it in a certain way. But that kind of quells some of the discussion. So this tension is I think interesting to talk about further. But sorry, Shania, over to you.
Yeah. No, I think this tension is really, really interesting, especially how in the hindsight, in the wake of Aragalia, things are being reframed and history is kind of being rewritten a little bit here. Because for our international listeners, Aragalia is the Sinhalese word to refer to the kind of people's protest that happened, people's protest that happened in 2022, when basically in the wake of massive economic mismanagement, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets for 3 months straight, making a daily encampment in a very public place in Sri Lanka, just in front of many government offices, and basically protested for government change, culminating ultimately in the ousting of the then president Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and kind of ushering in a lot of hope for Sri Lankans. And this movement was extremely progressive in that it was ground up, but it was also extremely inclusive. So as part of Aragalia, at some point, there was an LGBTQ pride walk as well. There were many minority groups that were represented. It was most certainly not a majoritarian environment. And so in the wake of a people's movement like that, to see it being kind of rewritten as a potentially foreign interference act that was made possible through USAID or through, foreign development priorities, that's a dangerous rewriting of grassroots political change that is happening, and an effort to kind of park in any minority, like Malika said, any other, as non-Sri Lankan, non-native, non-indigenous, and therefore non-natural in the Sri Lankan context, when in reality, because it was a grassroots movement, it is very clearly natural, and a direction that Sri Lankan grassroots society is willing to move in. And I think the reason that I wanted to ask this question about the NPP government specifically is that the NPP government was widely thought to be kind of our hope for more progressive policies to come in, not just economically, but socially. They're one of the few political parties to have more progressive views on LGBTQ rights. However, we haven't seen any movement really on that since they've taken office. They had more progressive views on certain acts in Sri Lanka, such as the Prevention of Terrorism Act, that was historically used to oppress minorities and deprive people of freedom of speech rights and detain people very easily. And we haven't seen any movement on that yet. And so this kind of, the image that's coming to mind is sort of like a crab that's out of its shell, but crawling back into its shell now that it's actually in a position of power, right? Where we had all these hopes of progressiveness that are now being clouded over by a dominant rhetoric. And yeah.
I mean, yeah, that kind of describes, I think, quite accurately how a lot of us are feeling. The important thing, Shania, I guess, is that when Sri Lanka had its national economic crisis in 2022, and then we have this Trump's unilateral announcement of tariffs happening just a few years later, when Sri Lanka is still very, very fragile economically, what happens is also this, that economic issues kind of tend to constantly dominate the political space. And I think we have seen that happening in Sri Lanka, but also in neighboring countries as well. And so that often also gives the political actors this rationale to say that, look, we are really committed to the progressive things that we talked about, but that has to take a backseat to the economic instability that we are facing. But then, the question is for how long that is possible. Like you said, with the NPP, they were the first and probably the only mainstream political party to indicate decriminalization of sexual and homosexuality in Sri Lanka. And while that itself is a major step, we have seen once the government has been in power, and it has been in power for 1 year now, again, despite vocally reaffirming its commitment to this, it is taking a step back in terms of actually passing the legal reforms and in terms of making the society, again, more receptive to this kind of reform. So that it's there. Just one more thing I just wanted to mention. You said that there is this sense that the democratic upheavals that are happening in our countries, especially in South Asia, because there's been a few in the last few years, that these are externally imposed, and that's really, it's really, I don't know what the word is. It's not a good thing, because there is this sense that, of course, liberal democracy in our countries is under attack, and it's losing legitimacy, and it's something that is probably not necessarily working for the kind of societies in the global south. But that should not take away democracy or democratic spirit that has been in our countries way before even the colonizers came. And so to not confuse these two things between liberal democracy as a governance regime versus democratic spirit as something that our people have always had, I think, for a long time. But yeah, maybe I'll let the others speak as well on this.
Sounds like I didn't speak for a long time, but let me take this one 30 seconds
Yes.
because
Yes.
30 seconds in between. This what Rajni mentioned as this democratic spirit is very important, because that's, I mean, I like to call Sri Lanka a wild horse democracy, but it's very wild when its democratic spirit is challenged. This is when, you know, when Gotabaya Rajapaksa president was not only difficult but also changed the constitution to almost into making him make the government into a you know a democratic authoritarianism. Then what we see also in the region is that you know, like, how do we, I mean, you can't cook a protest, a mass protest out of, you know, like a few $100,000. It's not possible, and even the cost that gets people to come to a certain site is much more an investment. Like even the transport cost is much more investment than training someone to, or making someone to make the commitment of travel to topple a government. That's not easy. So this, I mean, but what's important is this narrative that within those nationalist camps emerge. It's also it also explains the tension that we have with liberal democracy, especially in a context where our governments, when I say our governments, like governments in the region, fail day to day on a day-to-day basis to meet the demands of the people. Demand the people. I like to come back to this point later, because it's a big story, you know, with so many young people and young generations. So I'll stop there. But the framing of the nationalists is that aragalayas or protests, what happened in Bangladesh, in Nepal, can be cooked overnight or like in a matter of a few weeks over you know, a few dollars, or like few $100,000s of funding is impossible. That really undermines the rules of the game here, right? Sorry, that's it. Maybe something like that.
Oh, no, that's pretty much it. So that's where I stand as well when I said that. The fact that I think what struck with me most was the constant delegitimizing of the Aragalaya once the US cuts came into being, because like Harindra and Rajni said rightfully so, it's not something that happens overnight where you suddenly wake up and realize I'm going to go out and protest, because I think we saw it coming, we saw it brewing, and we saw it taking shape. So, and I think the danger of things like this happening, and the danger of narratives like this picking up momentum, is the fact that it also is very quick to delegitimize the things that have actually made some kind of change, and, you know, been watersheds in the history or in the future of where the country is going. So I completely agree with what Harindra and Raji brought to the table as well.
Thank you so much. I'm a little conscious of time. I think we can totally rely also on our audience to maybe pick up some points that they want to know more about. But something like something you just said, we're talking about where we stand right now based on the decisions and the actions of the past. Given USAID's funding cuts, what are we seeing right now in terms of what's happening on the ground, especially with regards to women, queer movements, other minority movements in Sri Lanka? And what has it revealed about the dependency of these movements in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, on foreign funding? Yeah. This is for the team, not to pinpoint. Sanalika, sorry. I keep doing this.
Yeah. Everyone keeps being like, Sandhaneka, say something.
I mean, Harindra was part of a project recently, a study actually, where we worked with Harindra and myself actually. We worked with sexual and gender minorities, trying to understand the challenges that they went through. So Harindra, maybe you can take this point.
Yeah, I mean, I can, but I also mentioned a part of it at the beginning. This organization that I mean that we are working closely with is it's a group in a remote city with a group of LGBTQ persons. So after the funding cut, I mean they were small organization where like it's almost like voluntary. And after the funding cuts, they have not been able to make the ends meet and get the community to meet. You know, like this is a clinic and where they like look into the health and safety of these people, and also a point of connection. So that's the kind of thing that emerges, and also it's but there was this it so that's how it got like how it lost out. But also these narratives that like even when we have conversations with them, with some of the engaged citizens of these communities, what they say is from how they perceive funding, and especially how funding has been spent in Sri Lanka was from a not a very welcoming perspective, especially with regard to the so-called inclusion in NGOs in Colombo. So what they say, what they think is like one in they are wasting money, and these big workshops, staying hotels on the one hand, like it's like extravagance. So that's not a one. Is that there was not really a good way of spending money, not a rational way of spending money. On the other hand, she also said, well, these guys are not talking about the kind of this is coming from LGBT people, like they are not portraying our culture correctly. So there was this imposed, this it kind of portraying the internal tensions that you have, which is like the Colombo has one version, and regions are more trying to be more conservative, like trying to play within the confines of the cultural idiom. So these tensions always remain, and even in the funding space, it kind of shows up. But overall, like I can take the example of the women in need, where funding cut was like very severely hit, and then it was some some voluntary quite good networking, but it's local philanthropists who came to rescue. But again, it's not sustainable now. Like after a few months, when I like inquired for this study, I mean, they for the call today, what was the situation? They said like they are hardly managing it, and probably yeah, I'm looking for sources of help and all that. Yeah.
I mean, if I can just add on to Harindra, what he was saying, it is that, I mean, with these funds, especially the US funding cuts, what was really exposed at that moment was like what has been discussed so far, in that how dependent we are on this funding, external funding, but also on the divisions that exist among the communities within Sri Lanka. So when we were speaking to these communities, as Harindra said, there were very credible complaints about how a lot of these NGOs, especially those that are based in Colombo, funded by the West, they would come to these regions and then they would kind of parachute excellent regional leaders and then either bring them to Sri Lanka, to Colombo, or outside of the country. And what this meant was that regional centers of solidarity would not be able to emerge. And like Harindra said, we have cultural differences, or like different cultures within Sri Lanka, but they feel that the more liberal Colombo culture kind of tends to sexualize LGBT communities, and they feel that their kind of expressions are not adequately represented. And so this is really a key question, I think, that all of us are asking in the context of aid cuts. Some of us, at least myself, I was hopeful that when the aid cuts happen, that communities within Sri Lanka would work together, not because of some project, but because we actually have some issues that we need to work together on. So far, from what I can see, is that, okay, maybe such stopgap measures are happening, but to a large extent, the zero-sum thinking that happened or that was cultivated during the aid regime, it continues to divide us, and it continues to divide the communities in terms of how we relate to one another. Yeah, so that's something that I wanted to say.
Rajni, would you say that there's this like, I mean, I do think this is true, that the NGOs that are based in Colombo might occasionally have a bit of a elitism, that their way of practicing, I guess, activism is the way that all grassroots movements should be aspiring towards. Is this part of the tension that you were picking up?
Yes, I mean, there is that sense of that kind of lack of inclusivity of people from beyond Colombo, and especially from minority communities, being used as subjects, but not really represented in substantial ways that they themselves are empowered to then have an active role within this collective community. So there is a very strong sense of that. And even in the absence of aid cuts, I think that has continued to be the case.
Yeah, if I can like just clarify, not clarify, but add this. When during the local government elections, when there was this candidate, in Sri Lanka, this the LGBTQ candidate running for elections, and that could have been. It was also happened with the time when we met them, this group, large group, and only one person of them from the city, I've not mentioned the name of the city, but they knew of not Colombo, but a faraway city. They knew that this was happening. So it was like after so much of communication, like promotion. So there was this. I don't know. It's difficult. There is a certain there is how you would feel inside within the community is also diverse. There are different narratives that gives them empowerment. So as Shania, you rightly mentioned, there is this perception of Colombo's elitism or like homogeneous kind of there's only one way to be, to have one identity. It's kind of is what they are trying to challenge. Yeah.
I guess just to push back on the idea a little bit, playing devil's advocate slightly, right? I think over the last few years, we've seen, I think, a little bit more prominence of grassroots civil society movements, specifically with regard to the LGBTQ movement. So, for example, Jaffna Pride being organized, right? And I know that this is still very much, this is still a major economic hub, right? It's not like Jaffna is rural by any stretch of imagination.
Yeah.
However, I still think it's quite significant, given that for the longest, for our international listeners, Jaffna is in a region of Colombo, is in a region of Sri Lanka that was deeply affected by the war and was one of the most war-affected regions. And so to see civil society movements growing like this now, just 2 decades after the end of the war, this is very significant for us. So I think that's something that brings me optimism. But do you think, what do you think grassroots movements, and how do you think we can see more solidarity between, I guess, the movements in Colombo and the movements in the non major cities, for example?
Yeah, I think this is one of the conversations we're trying to have, because I mean, I come to this point. Probably is it now this. It also comes in this financial, like economic disparity. Like some organizations, like in Colombo, get the funding, and then they use, like Rajni used the words subjecting the periphery. So once that equation kind of dilutes in the scarcity of funding, probably these narratives and all can submerge a little bit so that more communication, more understanding, more conversation among these groups is possible. I think what we need to look forward to is more what Rajni also mentioned, like more solidarity, more conversations, not just more conversations, just more conversations, so that you also understand how the other side feels and how much are they coming ready to come forward, to manifest themselves.
Yeah. So, do you want to add something?
Yeah.
Or are you good for this? All good.
I'm good.
Right. I mean, this is just off the cuff, but when we talk about solidarity, I mean, this is, of course, even like so ourselves, when we think through these issues, we also face limits in terms of the communities that you build. It's not something that you build overnight. There's a lot of mistrust within our society, I think, for very good reasons. And this was also a question I think that we had. We talk so much about solidarity and collectivism, but we draw the similarities among what is happening, say, in different South Asian countries. So when the protests were happening in Bangladesh last year, I remember even on social media, we had like a flurry of posts saying, solidarity with our Bangladeshi brothers and sisters. And we're seeing the same thing with Nepal. But I think that one of the issues is that we don't move beyond celebrating these similarities. How much of interaction happens actually among, say, young Sri Lankans and young Bangladeshis or Nepalis when these instances happen, beyond beyond messages of support, but to say, how can we actually organize collectively, and how can we think through these issues collectively? And conversations are, of course, one good way to start, but of course it has to, I think, move beyond that. And that includes being in each other's spaces physically. I think it's really important to be in those spaces physically, to have those conversations. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rajni. I'm conscious that we have 2 questions also in the chat, and I would like to get to them. Thank you, Noan and Sanan. But I do also, again, kind of want to tease out this tension that's emerging in our conversation, right? We're seeing a almost concentration, historically, because of how funding has been. We see a concentration of movements or attention or support for urban grassroots movements, primarily in Colombo, and that has meant that there's been a disconnect.
Bucky, hey.
Okay, a disconnect of within the movement itself. I think to Shanya's point, which is using Jaffna as an example, I do think that the difference is also sometimes Colombo and Jaffna are like, there's just such a different, no worries, Pippa. There's a disconnect between, not even a disconnect, there's just a difference in culture. But I want to combine what we were talking about earlier about opposition framing certain minority rights movements as antithetical to Sinhala Buddhist culture, and what that means for then local support from or allyship from people who are not within the community, to step up with grassroots movements outside of Colombo, whether that is through funding or through just vocalizing support, what that means. I think there's a barrier, at least my sensing is that there's a barrier, which means that yes, grassroots movements from different regions can come together and support, but when there's a lack of funding or limits to the stopgap measures that can be implemented, there's also still the problem. I mean, the problem still continues to exist, really. I do then want to follow up with what Sanan was saying, which was, given that there's these funding cuts, given that we can't really rely fully on the on individual giving from Sri Lanka, what role can recipient countries and domestic organizations play in developing more diversified sources of funding? Any thoughts? I know that that's the big question, even in philanthropy, and we don't really have an answer there. But any thoughts from the Muragala team?
I think maybe
Let's,
I remember
Sadhuleka,
Sadhuleka had some thoughts on this, so not to put you on the spot.
No,
but-
no. So this is, you're asking in terms of alternatives, right? Like, what can we look at? So I think I was having this chat with Rajni as well, because like the government hasn't been very vocal about it. And to be very fair, we all know the kind of money that USAID brought in. And it's unrealistic to think that certain groups can just come in overnight and, you know, save all of us from this, because it's only real that we assess it the way that we received it, because there's so much money at stake here, and there's a lot of money. Like, even I can't wrap my head around the kind of money that had been taken away from all of these really important work that has been going on at ground level. But having said that, I think what is really important to note is here, because some countries are actually seeing this as an opportunity to, I mean, it's interesting the way that they're wording it, because for them, even though they've been given like aid and funding, it almost felt like there was, US had this really strong a really strong chokehold, or there was a foot placed on their neck that they didn't want to let go. The donor recipient dynamics was pretty prevalent, and I think very tangible in these countries. So what most of the countries are saying is that this almost seems like an opportunity. It might be a little idealistic, but it does seem like an opportunity at times as well to function on their own. Having said that, what is important to note is that the traditional aid architecture is shifting. It's completely shifting. And the African continent has actually started adapting new ways in which they can think of how they can, within the country, like homemade remedies for this, but they can bring it. So in Sri Lanka also, I guess that what we really need to understand is that the reliance on Western donors is neither sustainable nor predictable anymore. And it's quite evident now. So diversification and self-reliance is obviously, they're no longer options, but they've become survival strategies. That means, I mean, Malika comes from this background, so it means exploring philanthropy more widely, domestic resource mobilization and equitable tax reforms, while also engaging with like regional partnerships, debt swap, blended finance, alternatives, so on and so forth. Because corporate partnerships, for example, can provide NGOs with access to financial resources because they have this budget allocated for CSR projects, right? So this is something that you can negotiate with and get to work with them. But I think at the same time, you have to be acutely aware of the fact that these collaborations are also with their own strings, because they might not come with the bilateral strings attached, but they do, or the geopolitical strings of traditional bilateral aid attached, but they do carry their own baggage. For example, short-term agendas, uneven accountability, risk of being shaped by private motives more so than the public need. So just to leave with, I think something to reflect upon is that we have to rethink the balance between external support and internal reform. And I believe that civil societies definitely have a crucial role in holding governments accountable and ensuring that in the process of scrambling for funds, we don't really sideline equity, inclusion, and all these projects that were funded by USAID as well. I think the space for reflection here is whether Sri Lanka can kind of capture this moment to shape it into a financing model that is resilient and not susceptible to external shocks, but at the same time, not depend on aid, which comes in new names and new avatars. So I think it's a very fine balance, and it's a difficult question to answer, like you said. But from my perspective, I believe it's a lot of thinking that needs to go and try your hand at new things, I guess.
Yeah.
I just, oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, Shania, please.
No, I had a different thought.
Yeah.
So
right. No, I just wanted to just add that, because I think probably it's a short conversation and we haven't maybe don't have the time to go into it much, but I really wanted to mention, like what Sadhuleka mentioned, I mean, so we're looking for alternative finance. Corporate finance appears to sometimes be especially with CSR and even philanthropy of big business players. It seems to be one of the avenues, but then we also know in the US, in Sri Lanka, the monopolization or the entrenching of economic elites is really, we're entering almost into a new stage of that. The kind of oligarchic politics that we're seeing in the US, within Sri Lanka also we have these big players where money really influences politics and again, overshadows the voice of more vulnerable
Oh. Rajni, you might be muted or stuck. Okay, let's just give her a couple of seconds.
Yeah. Yeah. So until she comes back, I will give the numbers to what Sandulika mentioned. I mean, last year in 2024, the NGO secretariat that counts that regulates the NGOs had estimated Sri Lanka receives around 30 billion Sri Lankan rupees in terms of aid. So that is about that's about, I mean, Sri Lanka's in terms of billions is like Sri Lanka's total from what the government earns. That's about 6%. So that's a lot of money. So I don't think that for the government to really fill that gap, I'm not sure. I mean, it's impossible. And yeah. So I mean, for education alone, for education, health put together, the government spends about 4% of its income. So of its revenue. So this means that the development sector, what it receives as USAID for aid regime is about 6%, and USAID contributed about half of it, and that can't be filled simply.
Virendra, so thank you so much for bringing up the budget point, because I think a lot of civil society in Sri Lanka has mentioned how our spending on education, healthcare is falling far behind standards that are being set by our regional counterparts, as well as even countries that I think, like, for example, that, I think we used to think of as less developed than us, that are now starting to really show us up. And so I think it's an excellent point, because insofar as we discuss diversifying our funding and becoming more self-sustaining, it does mean that if you don't believe that sustenance can come through philanthropy, it must come in through government budget allocations, and it must be accounted for somewhere in the equation. And that's the role I think that a strong government with progressive policies has to play in agenda setting. And on the topic of agenda setting, right, we had a great question from Nuan, which was asking about how the cuts are affecting peace and reconciliation efforts. I think this is an excellent example of a topic that was taboo for many of our governments to do tangible groundwork on. We have had multitudes of commissions and reports, but often it was the civil space that was actually going out in the ground and having focus group discussions, having spaces where members of multiple communities could come together and challenge each other's stigmas, have these conversations, right? So just wanted to ask you guys if you're seeing any impacts on peace and reconciliation efforts after the cuts.
Rachni, do you want to come in?
Yes, I'm not sure before when I was speaking where I got cut off. Yeah, I think I dropped off the call. Just quickly to mention, I mean, on peace and reconciliation, because it touches broadly on this human rights paradigm, and I think you had mentioned before about the PTA and the gap between what the government has promised and what was delivered. We are seeing that also when it comes to human rights, which is very closely related to peace and reconciliation, that not much tangible developments has been done with this government. There has been a noticeable dip in terms of nationalist rhetoric when it comes to politics, but beyond that, there has not been really, I think, progress with the Tamil question that caused the civil war in Sri Lanka, and in terms of reaching. So the government seems to be framing the issue mostly in terms of economic terms, so that the ethnic issue that we have in the country can be solved with a certain level of development. Whereas we all know that it's a much more deeper question of identity and rights and all of that. And really, I think in this context, again, when we zoom back to the global space that we are in, governments such as Sri Lankan governments, which has successively kind of infringed on ethnic rights and human rights within the global context of the human rights world order also unraveling, I think it gives a space for governments such as ours to not really be held up to the standards, because the West is also seen to be absconding these standards. So we do see that tension happening as well. Would anyone else like to add?
Yeah, let me, I'm kind of liking my voice, unfortunately. It's a very important question, how it relates to the question of like peace and reconciliation, because one thing we cannot do is separate foreign aid from foreign policy. I mean, let's frame it as foreign aid is always, if it's a government that's giving you money, it's giving you money as a part of its foreign policy agenda. And as US is moving itself out of the UNHRC, the human rights paradigm, the US is not committed to it anymore. And then we have in the current space, it is EU, Switzerland, South Africa and Japan that's trying to move around a little bit. Especially, it's very important for the peace and reconciliation, because most of the times these institutions like reparations commissions or missing persons office these are important organizations in the transitional justice process. So these have been always set up by foreign aid. So this time around, the government is trying to make the government of Sri Lanka is trying to like push it to move in that direction a little bit, because of the domestic compulsions in the north, and also because they thinks because like if you perform well on this, probably you can attract some foreign funding. So that's kind of the government thinking. But the peace and reconciliation drive, the commitments of Sri Lanka will suffer hugely from the cuts. Sorry, yeah. Thanks. That's it. I'm very happy I said it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for saying it, Harindra. And we like the sound of your voice, so don't worry about that. I was just wondering, and I know that we're currently on the topic of Sri Lanka, but I do think that we would like to wrap up in a bit. If any of the audience has a question, maybe from even the other sections, whether it was us discussing the politics in Sri Lanka and what opposition is saying and what that has meant for NPP, or even the broader context of USAID, the funding cuts, foreign aid as a tool of empire building, do please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I think we can move on to some of our final questions.
I think I have a question, which is on the slides. Haha. I think we've discussed how the landscape for queer and women's rights are changing, and the dependencies that we're becoming aware of, and the ways we're trying to shift our funding models. But something that I'm thinking about now that you've mentioned the differences between regional approaches to LGBTQ rights or women's rights versus the perhaps aid-influenced approaches to women's rights and queer rights. This discrepancy makes me think of, is there an opportunity for regional voices to be more prominent? And even aside from that, what other opportunities are on the horizon if we were to take a more optimistic glance? Because I think we have been rather cynical and rather critical throughout this conversation. And so I guess I'm inviting us to think about what we might be missing.
Yeah.
Yes.
And maybe I just mentioned, one thing that we kind of, we don't want to make it also economically reductionist, but this was one thing that one of the communities that we spoke to, one of the individuals within it mentioned, was that something along the lines of that we would prefer to not be seen as LGBT people first, but as people who are especially economically vulnerable people. And so if efforts towards either engaging with us, representing us could kind of prioritize that would actually make our lives a lot more easier than asking us to perform. I mean, this wasn't in verbatim, but rather than asking us to perform the role of being a sexual and gender minority, the kind of request was to pay attention to the fact that especially these communities find it difficult to make an economic living, as well as the kind of usually sex work sometimes that some of these individuals are involved in is very poorly regulated, and so they are made twice as vulnerable in the process of making a living for those who engage in sex work. So again, sorry, I seem to be going down the cynical road again, but I just feel like when we bring the economics back to the conversation as well, that might provide some common ground for working together. Yes, Harindra, I mean, yeah. Do you want to...
Yeah, I will. Yeah, you mentioned economics. I mean, I'll mention politics, because now, I mean, some things are happening. You know, like Sri Lanka is now actually, I mean, a very prominent group of people are talking about how to start a women's political parties. So the demand for inclusion is not just, you know, like it's. I mean, it's what is more cynical in this, like, is to think that we need foreign funding to address our own issues, because that creates a kind of a dependence. So probably, but then this moment requires us to rethink the way we deal with it, deal with the problem. So I think the opportunity of making our demands more political, negotiating with political parties, and with NPP something has happened. But more can be done, especially, I mean, having a women's political party would not really make a government of women, but it will add a lot of pressure on other political parties to act, and, you know, like co-opt. This is how politics work. So, so bringing more politics to it, to the discussion, and more writing, more, you know, I mean, it not necessarily doesn't need a lot of people these days to start a movement and make a case. So I'll stop there. So politics and economics, yeah. Say something.
For me, actually, this is not politics or economics or anything. But if we are to reduce a dependency and to make aware, so I'm an educator, so I believe that classrooms are the biggest disruptive spaces that you can use, and it doesn't really cost a lot of money if the educators are properly trained. And for example, I teach English as a second language for mainly STEM field, which means these students, and I come from a humanities background, right? Even the students I think here, one of the major problems I see personally as somebody who's been working for like 4 years in the education sector is the lack of awareness. And I believe classrooms are one of the greatest spaces that you can use to unravel this and to bring in some kind of critical pedagogy where you understand, because unless or otherwise you don't raise awareness, there's no way that we can engage in a collective dialogue or a discussion within our country, because most of these students, and I'm not putting the blame on them, of course, but like Rajni said, there are so many other problems that come upon them, where, for example, and I'm saying this is not a good thing, but for example, queer and women's rights are the last thing on their mind sometimes, which I think is actually sad and terrible, because I'm sure there are students who, if they were aware, would have wouldn't have had identity crisis, or would have had a better coming of age, right? So for me, I guess, because this costs zero money, because we have enough and more educators that we can club together and run them through this program. One thing that I realize is our curriculums are pretty outdated, and they really need to be updated in the sense of, when we are talking about one subject, we're talking about business, and we can also talk about it in intersection with subjects such as women's rights and queer rights, because we have enough entries to talk about these things in that way. I think we'll be breaking a bigger barrier than we think. And because in my head, for me, it doesn't cost more than what it already does, because I'm anyway getting paid money. And I'm just doing the work, except that I'm just enriching the curriculum a little bit more. And this is come from a completely educated background, most of the research analyst background. So this is something that I also ponder most of the time, whether this could actually convert to be something better and can create change. So yeah.
Yeah, I think if we were to take the economic language that is now being used about aid and say, like, what's the return on investment that you gain from, making the small additional investment into education? I think you're right that the multiplier effect could be massive, right? And could, in the long run, compensate for to an extent of some of the cuts. Obviously not the cuts that are, you know, taking money away from women's shelters or from domestic violence hotlines, things like that, right? Obviously, we cannot compensate for those things, but there's still a long game to be played with education here. Okay, before we wrap up, we have one more question from Sanan, which is to just explain a little bit more about how US aid to Sri Lanka influenced Sri Lankan domestic policy and was a tool of US foreign policy. I think this is a good question because maybe we all took it for granted because we are all Sri Lankan, but perhaps it's good to, you know, spell it out a bit more.
Would either
Right.
of you like to? Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'll answer half the question. Well, I mean, first, let's look at I mean, let me come to the question from the other side. I mean, the elephant in the room is the rules-based order that we talked about. That the West, I mean, West doesn't like being called West because the EU says no, we are not the West. You know, so EU and the global North generally talks about the rules-based order. And rules-based order worked for the global North for a long time, for a long, like, post to World War II scenario. And it is in that context that rule-based, the other countries were required to or invited to, encouraged to play within the rules set up by multilateral organizations. So it is in that context that we have to first look at the issue. And then, it is, let's consider it's important to think of countries, rich or poor. If they are rational actors, they wouldn't dump their money for no reason. So, so there has to be a gain, and what the gain is, gain as in a cost to dump, like, invest money in. So one way to look at it is this humanist angle, where, you know, like, the greater good of the humanity, you spend money, and which is a very, very solid, valid argument. And the other side of the argument is, like, you know, they also benefit from the rules-based order and democratic order, where where capital can freely come in and go out. Because, for example, because this question directly asks about how Sri Lanka benefited, how it was used, the US money was used as a foreign policy tool. If you look at the MCC agreement, for example, that Sri Lanka didn't sign, pulled out of, is the only one condition is that Sri Lanka remains a player. I mean, among many others, only the ingredient is that Sri Lanka remains a player in the global open market, and that's it. So open market, as long as open market remains, someone benefits. That's like, it's not specific outcomes. I mean, we shouldn't go to the extent of, like, regime change kind of experience. But, you know, like, it's keeping the field open. Sorry, it was a long answer, meant to be short. Sorry. Thanks.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I mean, yeah, sorry, what Harindra is saying there is, I think, really important, because always at the foundation of our conversations is, so there is this geopolitics and politics that's happening, but politics is never removed from economics. And given the fact that we are very much within a kind of capitalist state of development, which is entering new stages of development, I think it's important to then kind of realize the role of capital and how it functions, and how it entrenches certain kind of business interests through foreign policy. And I think we are seeing that very much within the Sri Lankan context, whether it is in the term of, like, say, multinational corporations working in collusion with local economic elite. So I think once we take the lens away from it being purely geopolitical, and also look at how capital functions within societies, and then how they tend to frame politics in terms of profit or in terms of interests over values, I think then we can understand what's happening in the global context a lot better. Because, say, when we talk about LGBT communities or talking about, say, what kind of the politics that we dream of, there's always values and the promise of a more equal society. Whereas the discourse of, say, USAID cuts or of Trump or of right-wing populism is very much of trying to make them value neutral. And I think this is kind of the fight that is ongoing, which is to insist on making conversations value-driven, I don't know, emotional, political, and not reducing them to economic logics of foreign aid or of business interests, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense because it's fundamentally the conversation about is your primary goal as a government or as a political entity to promote prosperity? And in which case prosperity for who? And prosperity how? Or is it to promote equality? And we do think of these things as two separate things, and often when the prosperity conversation is pushed to the forefront, as it did, for example, in the last Sri Lankan regime, the equality conversation is pushed behind. And I think the timeliness of this conversation is that we now have a government that championed a lot of the equality and rights-based topics that Rajni just mentioned, but now may be sliding into the prosperity dialogue as well because of the lack of international conversation on the rights-based dialogue. And I think that's where this pressure from civil society matters, because it shows that it's not foreign influences that care about rights. It's actually local influences. And it is homegrown and it is grassroots. And it's not just Colombo grassroots, it's grassroots from around the country. And I think that's a really, really important takeaway that I've had today. Yeah.
And I think crucially, when it comes from the ground up, it is placing pressure on government to say one cannot be done without the other, and one should not be framed as a binary, right? And I think that was also kind of the beauty of Muragala that you, Shania, pointed to earlier, that in its grounding of economic, based on the economic circumstances that many people were in, there was also a lot of solidarity building amongst different minority groups and others. So yeah, I think this was a really, really productive, amazing conversation. And I don't mean it to toot our own horns, but I think I learned a lot. Thank you so much, Muragala team. I think if for those of you who are on the call, thank you so much for staying and learning and listening and engaging with us. It was never meant to be a seminar. It was very much a discussion, and I think I'm very appreciative that the questions popped in the chat. I don't think this will be the last conversation, and I don't think it was all encompassing at all. It was kind of a taster of so much more that is to come, that will unfold. But I do hope that it gave you some insights. Yeah, so I'm very grateful. Please.
Yeah. And I'd also like to encourage everyone in the audience to please follow Muragala. They put out really interesting research and think pieces. And actually, in preparation for this call, we read quite a few of Muragala's think pieces, and we were like, wow, we didn't know what was going on at home. So yeah, I really just want to encourage you guys to keep an eye on Muragala.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Just Rajni, you want to say something?
No. I would just like to apologize. Since sometimes, especially I think me and Harinda, we enter sometimes from the academic kind of discussion, so I don't know how to chill and have more free-flowing conversations. So hopefully we'll learn that down the road as well. And like Malika said, I mean, we want to say everything in one webinar, and that kind of, becomes an obstacle. Yes.
I think
I think
we're getting compliments in the chat, so I don't think it was. I don't think you approached it.
You have a direct quote that says you were all very chill from a Gen Z.
Right. Okay.
Wow.
High praise.
Yeah. And San, like we must thank San because it's a very sharp question, because that also kind of really helped frame the conversation. And it's like that those kind of conversations and questions like really help like confirm that, you know, we are talking to a group who's really thinking about things, you know.
Yep.
And it's a learning curve for us also. Also at Muragala, we are trying to bring all kinds of conversations together and you know, like think differently, also ask the same questions from a different angle and all that. So I mean, that's a bit of jargon. And thank you for, you know, Shania, for the little advertisement for Muragala. Thanks.
Always.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think this is great. Thank you so much. And stay tuned. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
everyone
Guys.
for joining.